Thank you all for joining us. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. I'm Lisa Placanica. I'm the Senior Managing Director for the Center for Technology of Licensing at Weill Cornell Medical School. We handle all intellectual property and commercialization for the medical campus. This is the third panel discussion in a series that we put together covering digital health. So if you've joined us for the prior two, I'm happy that you're able to join us for the third. And if you're just joining us for the first time, I'm sure you'll still find this individual panel useful also. We'd like to thank our partners, Johnson & Johnson Innovation and JLabs for co-promoting this series of events with us. If you have questions, we will take questions along the way. I ask that you please use the Q&A function of Zoom so we can better track the questions. And so with that, I'd like to kick off today's panel, which is covering securing financing and the founder's experience in the digital health space. We have a great group of panelists together. We have Katie Baker, who's the Director for Innovation from Digital Care Delivery at Anthem, Alex Morgan, who's a partner at Khosla Ventures, Michael Laskoff, a serial entrepreneur in the digital health space, Asaf Zviran, who's a first-time entrepreneur who launched the company C2I Genomics, which is a spin-out from Weill Cornell Medicine in collaboration with the New York Genome Center. And Michael, and yes, I think that's all of the panelists. So in our first series, we covered really broadly what is digital health and how to protect it. And I think our key learnings there was that digital health really is just becoming, or will soon become, how we see healthcare, how we consume it, how we pay for it, how we develop it, and how we deploy it. And on the protection side, that patents can be important, but really data is king. The quality of your data, the diversity of your data that's driving your innovations is really the most valuable. In our second panel, we covered regulatory and reimbursement strategies at a very high level. And I think my takeaway was it is a complex landscape and one that companies need to start thinking about from the earliest stages. So understanding if your innovation needs to be approved, how to do that, and then really who and how is it going to be paid for. And in this third panel, now that we've covered some of these nuts and bolts, I'd really like to cover kind of how we put that all together from the founder's perspective, and then really from the investment perspective. So covering what are the things we need to know and think about and how to maneuver in that space. So with that, I'd like to open it starting really with the entrepreneur perspective. So Asaf, I'd like you to kick us off, telling us a little bit about your story of how you came to spin a technology out of an academic medical center and what that kind of journey has been for you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here. So first of all, my case is maybe not so typical because I came to the academy with the intention of developing technology that can be taken into the clinic and into the industry. So my background is actually I worked for more than 10 years in the Israeli defense industry developing radar systems. And after a personal encounter with cancer and experiencing firsthand the challenges, uncertainty, difficulties of the cancer treatment, basically I decided to change my field and to try to develop a technology that will allow both the clinician and the patient real-time information to guide and optimize treatment. So I moved to the academy, at first to the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and then moving to New York, to the New York Genome Center in Cornell, with the intention to develop something that can be applied for the patients. Once we validated the proof of concept of such a technology, I had the intention to move it into a company. I can say basically our journey had two different phases. So one phase is between having a proof of concept until getting the company going, and then basically the scaling up of the company. So the first phase took actually quite some time, so more than a year and a half until getting to the critical mass, both of evidence and team, and getting the first investment, what is called the value of death, of basically getting the chicken of an egg, so getting the licensing and the money to start the company going. But actually once crossing that point, the company skyrocketed. So we basically the late 2019, we incorporated the company, got basically got $1.2 million seed money. 10 months afterward, we raised $12 million. 10 months afterward, we raised $100 million. And currently the company is global, so with clinical trials that include hundreds of patients all over the world, the system is being used in the US, in Denmark, Switzerland, Singapore, and soon in Israel and other locations. So really an interesting journey and rapid scale up.
Great. And Asaf, was the journey what you expected, or were there things that, you know, as a first-time entrepreneur, you were like, wow, I didn't know I had to consider that as I was trying to spin out and launch a company?
Yeah, I think both phases were not expected, and both phases actually require different expertise and different connections. Basically, I didn't expect the challenges of basically getting the first round of funding and getting the license and the interaction between them. And that require a lot of expertise in basically in navigating that, in getting the right messaging, getting the right network, which us as an academy, basically we don't have the right network to bring the guys that need to put the seed funding. And actually, the other side, I was actually surprised by the acceleration of the next phase. So we are like going in a crazy pace and really a very successful scale up until now.
Great, and we have a question actually from the audience. So in this process, I guess, what was the point that was the slowest or the most difficult that you needed to kind of figure out how to get the momentum around?
Yeah, so definitely, again, definitely with the first phase of getting the technology out into the company, and actually the challenge there is less the minimal viable product, because actually in the academy, the access to clinical sample and access to clinical trial and basically getting the clinical evidence was even easier than as an industry. So basically, even during the academy, we had enough clinical evidence published in Nature Medicine and so on. But I think in order to get into the company, what is important is more like the critical or minimal viable team. So basically what the investor want to see, especially in the diagnostic and basically drug development space, there is a requirement for very high expertise. So getting the right team, getting the first investor that basically take the risk and put the first money, and getting the right network. I think these are the three main challenges.
Michael, maybe I can turn it to you, since it's not your first rodeo. You're a serial entrepreneur in this space. So can you kind of build upon what Asaf said? Like, what are some of the skill sets that you found most useful to make you successful? And also, how do you get that team gelled together in the beginning?
Well, I would be delighted to. And again, thank you for having me here. I want to color my answer with sort of two perspectives, that of my own of having started a couple of businesses in the digital health space. But also, I think it's important to note that I was an entrepreneur in residence at Weill Cornell for a year. So as I try to think, as I answer, I'm going to try to give you the perspective that I had personally, but also try to color with some of the perspective that I've seen. And some of the perspective I've seen of academics is I used to give this sort of stock and trade speech, which went basically like this: you are all rocket scientists, now learn to think like a plumber. And which is to say that the big idea that you've had already. And if you've done your job pretty well, you probably know the science part works pretty well. But if you live in a world in which you have great rocket science, but your toilets don't work, your world is pretty awful. And if you're going to start a business, you really have to be mindful of all of the things that maybe you don't feel so smart about, that you don't feel like you have such expertise in. And I think, referring back to what Asaf said, there's this tremendous need at a moment's notice to acquire new kinds of expertise. And I like to think that if the kinds of the skills and that which you require to succeed, there are a bunch of things we could obviously talk about, but I thought I'd focus on just three. And the first, and I think particularly for academics, is to think about your willingness to invest time. We all want a situation, where management and investors come together, as we all want risk-free innovation, and it's obviously an oxymoron. It doesn't actually exist. So generally speaking, as an academic or somebody who has roots in academia, the notion of burning the ships, of actually saying, I believe so strongly in an idea that I'm willing to sacrifice something that I worked very hard to get, often, which could be tenure or a particular kind of appointment or whatever else, that I might give all of that up to do something I'm passionate about is very difficult for, I think, a lot of investors from this background to come to, but also very difficult for investors who don't see that kind of willingness. So one thought that one thing that I often brought up is, hey, no one's saying if you have like an academic appointment, you have to give it up, but would you be at least willing to like sacrifice a tenure a year to do it? Because if you're not, maybe this is not the right kind of thing for you. I think the second thing is a sort of sense of, it's not a skill per se, but the ability to embrace, to be realistic. And I want to be very specific about what that means. I think there are many good programs, including many of which Weill Cornell operates, where one of the things, to give a very specific example that people will talk about, is think about how big your addressable market is. And it's like, it's 1 billion people. And somebody like Alex, and I think he'll probably like touch on this at some point, will say, marvelous that there are 1 billion people who in theory could benefit from your product or service or whatnot. How many people will actually pay for it? Really pay for it? And can you see a way to get from where you are to how to connect with those people who will actually like write those contracts? And I think that can be difficult for academics to learn how to do, because academia is very focused on that which is theoretically possible, and entrepreneurship is focused on that which is actually possible in order to succeed. And then the final piece, just to actually circle back to where Asaf came back to, is very often, if you think about what you're trying to get to, particularly in the beginning, one of the very most important things you have to put together is a team. The reality is, if you've got an academic background or any other kind of background, there are all kinds of things you don't know how to do. And no one is suggesting that you should know how to do all of them, but you need a team of people around you who are credibly like committed to the cause, and who can actually like cover off on those sorts of skill sets that you might not possess. So that could be anything from finance to law to like sales specialists. In Asaf's case, I bet there's somebody who's very, very good at licensing in his world. Just the kinds of things to really like make sure you have all of the pieces, or the big pieces at least, necessary to get a business off the ground. So yes, I tend to go back to think like a plumber, think about how much time you're willing to invest in something. Can you be realistic, and can you convince a whole bunch of people to come along the ride with you even before you can pay them?
Great. Those are, I think, all good tips. I guess so. There is always you've mentioned a chicken and egg question. There is always the chicken and egg question when kind of launching companies, and I think I have kind of some related questions here that really anybody can feel free to jump in and answer. But how far along do you have to develop your product before somebody will be interested in potentially financing it or providing money to it? And how do you do that? How do you generate that revenue to develop your minimally viable product if nobody has yet invested in you? It seems this catch-22 chicken and egg that's very hard to solve. So I guess, what are some strategies people can think through to how to get to whatever a minimally viable product means with little or no funding or revenue generation? Alex, do you want to kind of weigh in on that maybe?
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of different schools of thought. One is more sort of the Paul Graham Y Combinator approach, maybe even the coming a little bit out of Stanford Design School, which is focused on launching early, trying to get feedback with something very, exploring the market as much as you can, even in mock-up ways, going out and interacting with potential customers, showing them prototypes, just trying to get feedback even without necessarily launching the product. If you can get feedback, people excited, testimonials about why they would want this, even sometimes in the more kind of enterprise technology, you can get a letter of intent saying, if this thing was built and performed in such and such a way, I would want to purchase it or do a licensing agreement and so forth. You can actually get those agreements depending on again, we're talking about an enormous range of products, I think, in this space, everything from apps going after consumers through to very large healthcare, infrastructure automation systems where your customers are large health plans or health systems. So there's there's not a single answer. The other approach, approach is one that is perhaps a little bit more capital intensive, where you're trying to create a new market where maybe your customers aren't even necessarily clearly able to describe the product that they want, but you have a vision. Then you're closer to the needing, to talk to investors and sort of promote this idea. If you have patents or scientific technology that shows that if the market is, if there's market risk, but if you solve that problem, it's clearly a protectable technology that only your company can offer it, then that's a slightly different positioning. And there are companies that are constructed that way, that the thesis is, I don't know if there's product market fit. I'll have to do some work to develop it. But if it is, this is the only company that will be able to satisfy that. And the market is, for a bunch of rational reasons, quite large. I hope that, there's always hard to give one size fits all answer in a very diverse space. I think more often in the latter category, the sort of secret would be basically team. And that often means getting a really strong group of several individuals together, because then investors and even potential customers, because if the product doesn't quite exist, you're trying to convince someone that you can build this. It's by having, to Michael's point, having the sort of confluence of many talented people that we think it's credible. If anyone can do it, this is the team to do it. And let's say you have something that integrates, physical technology and, an information science, where you have like a really good person in machine learning, one of the best people in that, disease category, and then a really good person in some aspect. Then people start to trust that this thing can be built. And so it reverts to team. So again, if in the absence of some things, you can just have really good people to say, I have this vision, I'm going to invent this thing, and that can be credible and catalytic on its own. I guess I would say, personally, I've experienced in all different flavors of this. So when I was at Stanford, I was involved in creating technology that went into several companies, including Personalis that I IPO'd a couple of years ago. And now that I've been in venture capital, I've been involved in helping create companies out of academia, or at least foster them. There's one actually that came out of, or some of the founders came out of Weill. Luke Cantley is a co-founder. Marcus Gonsalves is a company called Faith. It's a cancer nutrition company. And that had a certain flavor because it has a sort of all-star cast of Mukherjee's involved, people from cancer, the head of cancer research, UK's technology group. There's a lot of really strong people involved. And that was done around a big vision, a set of really strong founders, and a sense that we could protect some aspects of that business. And that could be a prototype. And then there are lots of other constructs, right? We're doing something with the New York Genomics Institute with Opentrons, a robotics company that's about scale, and they are doing a lot of the testing for COVID in New York area. So there are all kinds of different structures. Let me pause. I don't want to monopolize all the time.
And I almost want to say, to some extent, it's training a scientist to realize there's a different type of research that needs to be done, right, in the early stages. And instead of at the bench or coding, analyzing clinical data, it's now researching your market, researching your payers, researching your market segment, researching your competition, and telling kind of a story around that.
Yeah, I think there's to kind of follow on some of the things that Michael said, there is, I think a lot of academics don't realize they're entrepreneurs. But when you're given a new faculty position, you're given a startup package, which is like your seed capital. You're given some space and some opportunity, but you have to succeed as a sort of independent entity. There's some support, but you really have to succeed as an independent entity. You have to hire, which is great. Well, in order to succeed, you have to hire well. And as a new faculty member, it's a potentially competitive market where new graduate students, postdocs could go to a different lab. You don't have a track record yet, so you have to convince them to join this new entity on vision. And then you have, of course, your performance metrics. You have to get your H-index up, and you have to, in most cases, get indirects for the university to cover your lab space, and then off to the races. And so you've shown that you'd be a successful entrepreneur in a certain framework, and then it's just a matter, as you said, and as Michael said, of just switching to a slightly different framework. And there are different incentive structures and different performance measures and different things you need to do. But those core things are still there. You have to have vision. You have to convince people to join your vision, and you have to get resources, and then follow through and execute well on whatever vision you construct.
Great. Maybe Michael or Asaf, we also had a question from the registrants of, when is speed to market important, or is it important? And if it is, how do you, I guess, accelerate that?
Yeah, it is always important. So that's actually the most important thing in order to be able to defend the company, get a market share, be able to be competitive, and generate barrier to entry for others. because IP can never protect the company. So IP is nice, IP is a good asset, but at the end, if someone want to infringe your IP or to go into the market and they have enough power, they will do it. So the only way to defend yourself is to be quick enough to scale up, to get the market share, and to scale up also the technology and the extent of the product that you are delivering.
I was going to say,
go ahead.
Michael, can you also comment? I mean, is speed to market maybe more important in sort of this space than, say, I guess, a traditional therapeutic small molecule, for example?
Yes, I'm so glad we're not talking about therapeutic small molecules, because I am not nearly smart enough to actually have anything to say about what you have to do get to through the FDA. I would say speed to market is an interesting problem. It used to be that, you go back 10 or 15 years ago, and somebody who had a new idea for a company in the services space would actually quite typically come out of a university or a hospital system, and they'd have an idea, and then they'd kind of incubate it, frankly, over the course of 3 or 4 years, and then they'd raise capital. And all of that has now sort of turned on its head of you have an idea and you go get capital. And right now the market is awash with capital looking for good ideas, which is good and bad. It makes it easier to get capital in theory. But the expectations that come with that capital are horrific, which is to say, and I'm going to throw, Katie, I want to warn you, I'm going to throw you under the bus lately. On behalf of the payer segment of you get to be the designated speaker for that. There are real constraints in the industry about how fast some things can happen. And so the idea is that on the one hand, there's this ever greater desire to accelerate, to show that you can achieve scale in particular. Again, lots of smart people, lots of good ideas. The objective is to get out and prove that you can execute, which is, I think, a lot of what MVP is for, and then actually achieve scale. And when you're looking for, particularly if you're going to be dealing with the payer space, they have to see both. They have to see both the ability to get something done and the ability to say, if I turned on 10 million covered lives to you tomorrow, what would you do? Would you, because there are too many companies that have blown themselves up that way. And the joke is scale is where great companies go to die, because they can do something at a very, very small basis, but they cannot do it at a larger basis. And so I would just say that when thinking about speed to market, and therefore the amount of capital you might take to accelerate there, it's good to be in Asaf's position where you actually know how to put $100 million to work. But it is frankly better to go a little bit slower, I would argue, than to take money that you can't utilize, because you put yourself into a situation where if you have capital that you've taken in that is not being well used, the only thing that you leave open to your investors is the opportunity to replace the management team. They don't know how to run your business, but they do know how to go find other people who will. So speed to market is super important. I think it's increasing. I think we're coming against some of those physical limitations about how much faster some businesses can go than they're going now. And it's quite challenging to be an entrepreneur to manage those things.
Great. I guess that's a good segue to Katie. So I think, we've talked about the valley of death and the chicken and the egg. And so Katie's with Anthem Digital Incubator. And I'd like to hear sort of the genesis and the history of sort of how ADI came to be. I think it's relatively new. I think it was launched in 2019. And sort of what services or tools can you help kind of budding companies with in this space? And do you see any of your payer peers kind of also having an increased interest in this space?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks for the bus. Appreciate it. So I'm just teasing you. To step back a little bit, as everyone knows, incubators have been really popular for really the last 10 years or so. And there's lots of companies that have incubators. There's lots of individual or separate incubators that aren't necessarily tied to a company. The catch is really, how do you embed them in a company culture and find that path to market? And that's what we really try to do at Anthem. I know that there are other payers in the space that are tied to either an incubator or accelerator. I don't want to talk about theirs, just really because I don't know enough about them. But as far as ours, the great thing about Anthem is that we really help you co-navigate that and build that path to market. So we really look to surround you just like any other incubator for that matter, surround you with all the necessary resources we possibly can to make sure that you're going to be able to scale. And exactly to your point, Michael, we're looking for not only companies that are clinically valid and are proven, but we're looking for companies that then can scale. And so that's where, an incubator is so helpful, especially our incubator, in building a study with, increasing number of lives so that we can hopefully kind of make that a middle step where you're not just going from clinically valid to millions of lives and failing. We're hoping to kind of be able to like edge you that way a little bit slower and make sure that you can scale. We surround you with, both education live and on demand. And we do have some workspace, where you can be surrounded constantly by individuals within the payer workspace. But we really try to give you, internal mentors and navigators and things like that to really make sure that you don't fail, because it's in our best interest that all of these companies succeed.
And Katie, would you say from the payer perspective, sort of that the thread of commentary we had from the first panel, that like digital health will become healthcare is kind of a driving sort of reason behind getting involved in sort of helping these companies?
Yeah, I mean, we're banking on that. And so we have an entire digital team that is part of Anthem that is 2,500 people strong, and we're constantly looking at what are the new innovations, how can we leapfrog where we are now, how can we not only solve for problems today but be thinking about the next 18 to 24 months and then the next 5 to 10 years, and what can that look like. And so we're kind of in this staggered thinking of we have to address the problems that are real right now, but we know that the direction of which we're headed, and so that's where we're thinking about in the next 3 to 5, 7 years.
And is there a particular, I think as Alex said, and I think as we covered in our first panel, like digital health, I use that as a catchphrase for everything, right? Digital health, right? It's huge. But is there particular segments of digital health that in Anthem as a payer is particularly interested in fostering or in investment?
So, I mean, we're really looking at, oh gosh, that's actually a really challenging question. Who knew? We're looking at things like a lot of digital monitoring, digital therapeutics. We're really focused on a lot of chronic conditions, behavioral health, but then again, all the way to the back end and looking at EMR. And so we're really looking at, how do we digitize literally every aspect of healthcare, from patient side to provider side and everything in between. So I can't tell you that we're just looking in one space. We have different teams that are focused in a variety of different spaces, so that we're really thinking holistically about digital healthcare and not just tackling one piece at a time. Great.
And I guess, does Anthem actually invest in companies? Do you have like a venture or corporate investment arm?
We do. So we do have an investment arm that does look at companies. The incubator itself does not, at least for now, invest in companies. We really support through, I would say, the pilots primarily, and this is really a case-by-case type of investment. There are always opportunities for funding for sure, but usually the pilot is the best way to get to that point for funding. But we do have an investment arm that is constantly looking at early stage companies, and they're part of the enterprise, not necessarily part of the digital team.
Great. So that, I guess, brings us to money, which is, I'm sure, why many of the panelists are here. So, I think Alex and Michael said, we're awash in money, apparently. And I think that is true. We've seen lots of, huge fundraising for a lot of venture firms, but I think from boots on the ground, from small companies, it seems hard to get to that money. So if we can kind of start to delve a bit into that, so kind of maybe I'll kick it off with either Alex, like, how can when should a company target maybe a small angel investment versus, a venture capital firm like Khosla? Like, what is their distinctions, and what's the right timing?
So, it's a big question. I think one of the things to remember, though, is investors are in the startup services business. So they are actually most investors, there's a portal and some way to submit a business plan, because that's, they need to source new interesting ideas in companies, and it's their job to look at them and look at those ideas and think about them. And there are a lot of different groups out there. There are different cultures and different pockets and sort of typology of investors, right? There's sort of more of many of the people listening probably in New York, and there are groups that maybe come more out of a finance, private equity background, and they're looking often for companies with business metrics. There are more sort of the Boston style, which are often a little bit more IP technology focused, because they think about constructing companies in more of the biotech framework. There are more the Silicon Valley style. And again, you can have a Silicon Valley style firm anywhere in the world, but that's focusing a little bit more on quote unquote disruption of markets, and they can be often grouped into investment groups that are a little bit more engineering focused, and some that are a little bit more marketing focused. But all of these things are of course relevant to digital health companies. So it's often more a flavor of, I wouldn't say necessarily calling it an angel or an institutional, et cetera. It's the kind of culture and flavor of the investor that you want and the partner that you work with, because you really, whatever title someone is, they're partnering with your business, and it's very hard to fire an investor. You can fire an employee or a partner even sometimes, but your investors are there, for the life of the company. And there's various things that can happen, but usually they're there for the long haul. And so you want to be selective about who you work with. I think the danger to some extent of being awash in capital in different groups is that, Michael sort of alluded to this. Right now you can be in a situation where companies can be overfunded in an exciting market, and that sort of sets an expectation for the next funding, and that can actually cause problems if you basically overfund, your valuation goes too high, and that makes it very difficult to do the subsequent fundraise. But that's, if your business is doing well, usually that's solvable. I think it's a key principle is if you have a good company, you can usually figure out all these other details. The key is focusing on having a good company, and that's often the challenging things, which, again, it's about team and, really understanding what you're trying to do in your market and having a differentiated product that works. I mean, there's usually a path forward. You can reach out to investors. A lot of them, they're very busy, so that any one particular investor may not respond to you, but there are a lot. If you're many of these things, it's like a sales process. You're trying to build a company. You can always anyone can have a company, right? You can sit down and create a company in an instant. The difference is having an operating business, and an operating business has sales. So your company has to be selling at some point. And sometimes you're trying to sell the idea to investors, and sometimes you're trying to sell the idea to customers. And it's a somewhat similar process. At the end of the day, though, you're trying to select times when you have or relationships where you're a fit for that individual. So there's never necessarily a perfect or right time. Sometimes going too early, you can get good advice. Sometimes, when you're seeking money, you'll get advice. Sometimes when you're seeking advice, you'll get money. That sometimes happens as well. So yeah, I think, remember, healthcare is over nearly 20% of the US economy, $4 trillion a year. So there's a huge opportunity for literally thousands of billion-dollar companies. So there's lots of opportunity here. So there's a great presentation by Benedict Evans called The Great Unbundling, which talks about all the ways that the pandemic has accelerated many trends, and digital health is just one of them. So I think this is a very unique time to try to construct a digital health business. I don't think in my lifetime there's been a better time to do so. So I think this is a great opportunity out there, and investors are paying attention. So I think if you work on developing a great company, I think getting capital there are a lot of opportunities if you just go out and ask people. There's so many different groups you can ask, and then you can decide if there's a good fit for you.
Yeah, I actually just have a comment on that. Sort of, I think you illustrate a point that sometimes is not necessarily clear to early entrepreneurs or early innovators, is you have to knock on a lot of doors. And even if the answer is no, I'm not willing to invest, to the extent you get feedback from the investor or the partner, that's so critical to pay attention and kind of feed that back into your product development, your business development, your planning. I find that those key interactions with partners, and a no with that type of feedback can be just as valuable as a small check with not a lot of commitment or not a lot of information. So I think that's important.
I want to give a bit of maybe a different perspective. So again, actually, fundraising is not only about the money. So basically, the money is not the resource that you are looking for in fundraising. And again, we're successful in the sense that in all of our rounds, basically we could choose the investor that we took, and actually in the last round we have more money on the table that we could handle. So, and what we were looking for is more the ability of the network, the value and the experience that we are bringing into the company with this fundraising, with getting this investor in our board, in our cap table and so on. And I think this is more important actually than the money. So you need to choose your investors by basically, first of all, who do you want to work with, and what is the network that they bring to the company, what is the value and the experience, and so on. And I think, again, from my experience, networking have been the driving force more than anything else. So basically getting the right network from the start. And in that sense, so one of the things that I think is missing to be able to move technologies more easily from the academy to the industry is the interaction with founders that already did it. And I think, interestingly, if you look, investors are constantly interacting between each other. So investors are talking with each other. Founders are not enough interacting. So basically, I think this is something that we can think about. And maybe Cornell and other institutes as basically to source founders that can mentor and support new founders, basically allowing them the experience and the network that can scale up their company. And the last comment about the extent of money. So yes, so definitely founders need to be mindful about the critical mass that they need to build in order to basically raise certain amount, to be mindful about the dilution aspects. So again, you don't want to get to a point that basically the founders don't have incentive in their own company. So you need to manage that very precisely. So there are a lot of aspects here that require a lot of experience.
Asaf, if you don't mind, Lisa, I'd love to just give a little counterpoint. And I would like to just remind everybody that Asaf's story of 1 to 12 to $100 million in less than 2 years is not the norm. So that it's a marvelous idea with a great team and a great product, and but many people have to work a little bit harder than that. So you may not actually have, and particularly when you're small, everything that Asaf just said about network is true. However, remember that it's not uncommon, just in terms of for a partner at a venture fund to sit on somewhere between 6 and 8 different boards, maybe even, so God forbid, like 10. So that when you talk about like these theoretical networks, you're getting a small piece of them because they only have a finite amount of supply to be able to help and to provide network, and they do make choices. So I would say that just to be mindful of that. But to go back to the point, Lisa, that you made of, I joke, it took me 4 years to raise my first capital. So I started a company in 2008, 2009, and took my first capital in 2013. And I used to joke that pride is a renewable resource. I had so many people say, not only no, but no, you're crazy, that it was like, I did get a lot of very good feedback, but it was very difficult to take that. And the idea is that an entrepreneur is by definition a visionary. You see something that other people don't see. So when you're successful, they call you an entrepreneur. When you're not successful, they call you crazy because you're seeing something that other people still don't see. As you're kind of rolling forward, the one caution on advice is there are very good firms. Alex works for a very good firm. If he gives you advice, it's always probably to be taken seriously. Many other firms, though, are trying to, at times, obscure things, like the fact that they don't have capital themselves to invest, but they don't want to disclose that fact. They will give you reasons why they don't think they should invest in your business that may or may not be accurate. And over time, you get a lot better at distinguishing the parts that are valid from those that are not, but just weigh the quality of the advice I think you're getting at the time.
I think that's an important point, is that you should expect this. I mean, I sort of alluded to this, saying that you're trying to sell something and you're going to have rejections at first, especially, you know, there, and there's going to be rejections in at all aspects of your business. You will have rejections for reasons that are sometimes opaque to you, that have to do with their own personal experience in their own situation. And this, we're getting into something very fundamental with entrepreneurship, is you just have to, you know, accept a ton of rejection all the way through, because you're trying to create something that didn't exist and people don't understand it. And very smart people will tell you all the reasons that it will fail. All you should do is, you know, take that into consideration, rethink it from first principles, and decide whether that advice you think is correct or not. And if you're going to be dissuaded because some smart person, you know, after talking to him for two minutes tells you no, I think this is maybe not the right career choice for you, because everyone has different experiences, and experts are always experts in the old way of doing things. They're not experts in the new reality that you were trying to create. And so they're going to put it through the lens of all their previous experiences, some of which they may just have a bad experience with a company doing what you're doing, but it'll finally work when you do it. Not to get it too much in biotherapeutics, but immuno-oncology is a great example of that. It is theoretically interesting. People have been trying for years, and it didn't work for a long time until it did. And you may be doing something that didn't ever work in the past, but you might have a path, and just by better execution, it may suddenly work. And so you'll have in fact, you will expect to have naysayers if you're trying to do anything significant. You will just have, there are so many incentives for people to say no for things. But it doesn't matter if you really are convinced and you are correct, and that's that in your vision, and you make it happen, then you can shift reality. And the best entrepreneurs shift reality to some extent. They accelerate the world in some way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The world they're not down a path of doing something, within the lanes. They're saying, okay, I'm going to shift the direction that the world is going in. And it can be in a small way, but small significant changes always look small, almost always look small at first, right? An exponential function looks very non-exciting at the beginning until suddenly it isn't, because it's doubling or some other property that it's accelerating. And so lots of smart people will tell you why what you're doing is a terrible idea. Many things in my life, people have told me whatever career change was like a terrible idea and it was going to be a disaster. Sometimes it is, but your ability to take risk your willingness to take risk is necessary. And here, most of the downside is incredibly bounded, right? As long as you're careful and you're doing many malfeasance, the worst thing that happens is then you start to look for a new thing because whatever you tried didn't happen. But the upside for a lot of these efforts is nearly unbounded. I think a lot of training in healthcare, even in academia, you get trained to be really risk averse because the downside is you hurt somebody. And the upside is that person lives a normal, healthy life, which is everything here is upside down. The worst thing that happens is you have to look for a new thing or you start a new project. And the upside is you change the world in some substantial way and create, billions of dollars of value and save, millions of lives, or, millions of quality after life years, or some significant contribution, or you save the healthcare system lots of money. So the risk paradigm that you may have you're trained in medicine is flipped here.
Great. We have a question from the audience. Well, I'm going to assume there's not a magic list of seed money providers. Like, so how is one best able to track down who's willing to invest? I mean, I know Alex, you mentioned kind of East Coast style versus West Coast style investors, but how does one start to find that?
You listen to what Asaf said. You network until you can't network anymore. And literally, if you only know, there is no magic. Literally, you pick up the phone, you send emails, you call and you ask everyone in your path, and you do that, and then you get up the next day and you do it all over again. I'd be curious to hear if there are more subtle approaches that other people suggest, but I've never seen anything work other than full court press, everything available.
Yeah. And I agree. So the first investment is always the hardest. For us, it took more than a year and a half. Every month we received a new negative answer, as Alex said. So basically, and I think the best advice is to find someone that did similar path, that have the experience, have the network, can help you to basically refine the message, refine basically what you're presenting, to get to the right people. There is a lot of network and experience here that basically you can benefit if you find the right people that did these things before, and they can help you. So I actually didn't have them, but later on, I got people that really helped me along the way.
But I think it's worth mentioning that you can often study very successful entrepreneurs and companies a little bit from a distance. You may not know Jeff Bezos, but you can read all the investor letters that he's written about the formation of Amazon, and it's basically like a mini business school there. There's a lot, and Bezos himself drew a lot from reading Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart's biography of how he built that business. He memorized that book. and on the path to his business. And I think there's a lot written out there. There are great experts that have founded companies. Phil Knight wrote Shoe Dog, which is a great, again, it's nothing to do with healthcare, but it's a great example of a person's experience. And I think there's a lot to be gained from studying, successful entrepreneurs, even companies in the past. And if you don't know, a very successful entrepreneur, you can learn a lot about what happened. People have described their journey often in great detail, and are very open about what's happened. So part of this is you're trying to, in academia, if you're in academic, you often study what great scientists have done. You can study what great business people have done, and a lot of that information is available to you. There are resources like PitchBook, Crunchbase that talk about who's been an active investor in different spaces. And, I don't want to necessarily endorse a product where you have to pay, but there are resources, particularly if you're affiliated with a university, they have, usually the business school has these lists of, you can access to some tools that they tell you who's been active in what areas, and you can find out who's actively investing. And usually that's good signaling that they may do more, although it's a little bit of one of the ways to think about it is they've done a bunch of investments in related companies. They may not invest in yours because sometimes there are some conflict issues, but sometimes you might want to talk to them anyway. Because if your business is inherently protectable and you're not giving away secrets, you can get feedback because they've researched the market, they understand, they've looked at companies like yours and understand trajectories. So even if they don't invest, they might have some insights.
I want to add to that. In addition to just doing your homework about the investors, and in some of those spaces, I would suggest doing your homework across the entire landscape. We have a lot of companies that come to us that don't really understand how payers work. And so, they want us to help them kind of build this plan with them. And really, we want them to come in with a plan. And so I would suggest really schooling up on the entire landscape of your business, really understanding, who your target is and how you're going to build traction in that space, especially if you're coming into a payer looking for them to be an investor, really understanding the payer background and understanding that company culture and how you're going to get your path to market, which again, not to keep bragging about an incubator, but that is where we can help in that space, is like payer 101 and really understanding how you can see yourself in the company and how you can grow up kind of within the company. But even if you're not looking for an incubator or something of that nature, I would definitely recommend doing your homework and coming in with an actionable plan.
And just actually, I was just going to say super quickly, just to expand on what Katie was saying, the most important thing that I think is implicit in what everyone here is saying is be prepared for the discussion. Access is marvelous, but you actually have to have something to say that will be meaningful to the people you're trying to, get money from. And that, so the thing that everyone, I think gets belittled, but this concept of an elevator pitch, of being able to convey your business in one sentence or 2 sentences maximum, is a really big deal. And if you're not ready to do that, you may also want to think about when you want to go out to a network. I'm sorry, Lisa, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No problem. I think that's definitely, if you're going to knock on the door, be able to converse when the door opens, I think is a critical message. Katie, just to follow on the payers, we had a question from the audience that I think is maybe you're well positioned to answer it, but can you explain in a little bit more detail what you mean when it comes to clinical validation for proof of concept for payers, especially in sort of the digital health app space? Like what would Anthem be looking for?
Sure. So, I mean, like any of these people, we're always looking for the 3 T's. We're looking for your technology, your team, and your traction. And everyone has kind of covered the team really well. The tech part, what we're looking for is clinically valid. So we're looking for white papers, or we're looking for you to have already proven this in some facet. We're not early enough that we're looking to be your first study. We're not looking to help prove out your technology. We want proven technology. We're at the point where we want to help you scale that. And so if you can't prove to us that your technology works, and that it is truly, and the difference is clinically valid, because technology is great, but we have doctors and people in the medical space that are looking at this and thinking about this from a patient perspective. And so that's what I mean by that, by being able to be clinically valid. So proving that your technology works, yes, but it also is solving a problem in a clinical space.
So maybe it may help to run through some resources. There are of course other incubators that may do a little bit earlier. So Y Combinator is one that will do basically an idea with the right team and their vision. IndieBio has offices in New York, and that's not quite digital health, but some of the things they do are kind of on that spectrum. JLabs, of course, was mentioned. They do a lot of stuff. Usually there has to be, that's a little bit more biotech focused, but some of the digital health companies are on that spectrum. Certainly a lot of great incubators out there. Rock Health is another one. They're more West Coast, but they have a great digital health process. And if anyone's interested in the space and you're a digital health entrepreneur, I really encourage you to get the Rock Health newsletter. It's a lot of information. You get to hear about what investments being done, what other companies are out there. There's a lot of good resources for you. We on our website, Khosla Ventures, have this have a whole thing about how to pitch the way investors think, where there's Vinod Khosla goes through a discussion of like how to do a pitch deck, what to put in it, how to think about it. That's a great resource. Alad Gill has a great blog where he's talked a lot about thinking about financing, and he was co-founded Color Genomics, done a lot of other interesting companies. He's got a great set of recommendations and actually a book that encapsulates a lot of his thinking. I think I forget the name of the book, but it's a great book. But his blog has a lot of great posts about getting strategically thinking about dealing with investors and so forth. So there are a lot of good resources out there that you can build a kernel of information, even if you don't know anyone. I don't know who's listening to this. You could be listening to this from anywhere in the world, and these resources are available to you.
Yeah, and I would also like to point out for those of you that are in a university or an academic medical center setting, many of these universities have resources to help, like the Center for Technology Licensing. Michael was an entrepreneur with our BioVentures eLabs group. Like, it is our job to help innovators within the institution find commercial outlets and avenues for their innovations, whether that's through startup or through partnership with an existing company, large or small. I mean, it covers really the full realm. And so we can help provide networks, we can help with pitch decks and all of that. So don't overlook that as it's a key resource also.
And I know a lot of universities do a lot around commercial viability to really understand, is that technology commercially viable and helps get to that next stage. We have, in the past, we have funded things like that around technologies that we're really excited about, that we're just not sure, are they ready? And so we've done commercial viability studies in partnership with the universities because it's something that we don't do in-house.
Great. And I think we have a few minutes left. So I think I'd like a round robin last question of really kind of what you see the current and future trends for investment opportunities in this space. So maybe we'll just go clockwise with how you're arrayed on my screen, which is Katie first.
Oh gosh. Hard. We are looking at a lot of AI, of course, a lot of AI, looking into a lot of VR and AR. As we think about like what it could mean from a payer landscape and building empathy. I would also say just a lot of digital monitoring.
Great. Alex?
Yeah, so my PhD was in machine learning and biomedicine, so that's a very active, will probably always be an active area for me to look at. But we're doing all kinds of things in women's health, in neurotech. We have a number of interesting technology investments in neurotech, in treating behavioral health, at-home monitoring. I think cancer, with Asaf's interested. There's like so much opportunity out there, and I'm always most interested when I'm surprised, when someone has identified a new opportunity or created something. That's the most interesting. So if it's an area that I can't think to name, that's often the most interesting. And I'm also happy if people have questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter if they're beyond the time of this, questions about entrepreneurship resources, how to think about things. Definitely, Genomics Doc is my Twitter handle. So happy to answer any questions that people have.
I second that, women's health, and anything in SDOH as well. It's so
Michael?
I'm going to be, I'll try to be the naysayer just so someone is for a moment. I think that there is too much money in the space right now. And because there's too much money, there is many of the good ideas are being buried with Me Too companies. And I think that we're going to see a lot of money go in, but we're also going to see a big retrenchment at some point in the next 12 to 18 months. And if I were smart, if I were smarter, I would be very much richer if I knew the timing. Just to be careful, to the point that Alex made, is it's far better. I would say it's far more exciting if you're almost like in one of those categories that isn't hot right now, because by the time a category is identified as hot, it's almost too late, I think, to to have the big breakout successes. And hopefully there are people on this call who are working on the big new ideas, the ones that we're not talking about, because that will be the future.
Yeah.
Asaf?
So in the medical space, I believe basically, I'm very excited about data-driven or AI-driven decision support. And again, I think basically on one end, we see the complexity, and this is also kind of where we are going with C2I beside the liquid biopsy. So on one end, you see the complexity of the data inside diagnostic is increasing. The time that the clinician have to see the patient and to go over the data is decreasing. So if an oncologist have 20 minutes to see, look on the case and decide what to do, in the 20 minutes, he doesn't have the time to go over all of the different genetic and information that is possible on that patient. So how to get all of the information together, integrate it, have a machine learning that can digest it, and basically support, show it in a reasonable way to the clinician and support the decision to make the right clinical decision at time. So again, I think this is something that we see more and more. And we'll be happy to contribute there.
Great.
Not only in cancer, by the way, in many different medical fields.
Great. Well, this has been a fantastic, I will call it capstone panel discussion, really synthesizing a lot of what we have explored and discussed over the past 2 to 3 months on digital health. It's quite an exciting field. I think if I could sum up today's discussion, I think it's, the power of networks and knocking on doors, and don't really underestimate the amount of time or effort that you need to put in to actually kind of make that successful. Any last parting words from any of our panelists? I think we summed it up. So thank you everybody for attending. As we said at the top of the panel discussion, this has been recorded. It will be available on the CTL website. We do have an upcoming event on May 20th with our partners, Osage University partners, the first of a startup series on founders equity and CEO assessment. So if you're interested in further education and mentorship on kind of early stage innovation partnerships, please keep an eye on events that are offered by CTL and our colleagues at BioVentures eLabs. And with that, I will give everybody 3 minutes of their day back. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.